In August this year, we opened our first temporary exhibition in our new changing exhibition space here at Great War Huts. It's the 110th anniversary of the outbreak of war, so it was called Outbreak 110. And it featured interesting artefacts and bits and bobs from around the time of the outbreak of the war right up until the end of 1914. And it was only once we'd actually got everything on display that we spotted a connection between two of the items on display, which are the two that we've got here today. And I thought it was a story that's worth telling. So in the summer of 1914, before the war broke out, the 5th Infantry Division was stationed in Ireland. And in the 5th Division, 14 Infantry Brigade had two particular battalions, one, 1st Battalion, the East Surrey Regiment, stationed in Dublin, and 2nd Battalion, the Suffolk Regiment, stationed at the Curragh. Now, the commanders of those two battalions were Lieutenant Colonel James Longley of the East Surreys and Lieutenant Colonel Charlie Brett of 2nd Suffolk. And there's no doubt whatsoever that over time, the two of them would have socialised together, they would have visited one another's messes, they'd have been on parade together at different times, certainly mixed socially as well as in training exercise and things like that. Both battalions mobilised with the 5th Division on the 5th of August 1914, and 5 days after that, they're ready for active service. They head over to France a few days later, and after landing, they move with the rest of the British Expeditionary Force towards the Belgian border and cross into Belgium. The East Surreys are quite involved in the fighting at Mons on the 23rd of August. The Suffolk's a bit of action. There's a few of them who are killed, one officer captured, but luckily not so much for the Suffolks. However, a few days later on the 26th of August, they do find themselves very heavily involved in the Battle of Le Cateau, or as the old soldiers called it, Le Cateau. What's happened after the fighting at Mons, the British Army, as it starts to retreat south, comes across the forest of Mormal, and 1st Corps goes to one side of the forest, 2nd Corps goes the other, and the two parts of the army start to diverge. It becomes obvious to Sir Horace Smith-Dorrien, who's commanding 2nd Corps, that there's going to be a need to stop the Germans and hold them off long enough for 1st Corps to get away. And he makes the decision to stand and fight just south of the little village of Le Cateau. And in the early hours of the morning, they start digging in very rudimentary scrapes along forward-facing hills, and it doesn't offer a great deal of protection, but that's all there is. The artillery are drawn up in the open, literally just behind the infantry, firing over open sights, so not, firing at great distance. They're literally in amongst the infantry. And when the Germans attack, first thing in the morning, it's pretty grim. It's a pretty rough time for everybody concerned. Colonel Brett is standing talking to the commander of one of the artillery batteries, and he's hit very, very early on. He's hit in the head. He may even have been killed outright, but he certainly died of his wounds very shortly afterwards. After the war, Mrs. Brett makes enormous efforts to try and find where Charlie's buried because he has no known grave. And she writes to everybody she possibly can, including the two stretcher bearers who carry him from the battlefield. And they describe picking him up on the stretcher, taking him behind the artillery guns and heading across the field, down a little step and to a dressing station in a sunken lane. And they left him there on the stretcher. She also interviewed a Frenchman who remembered after the fighting, when the British had retreated, he discovered a whole load of dead British soldiers, including Charles Brett, and he'd got his name written on an ammunition box lid laying on his chest. And he buried them all. And after the war, he went back to try and find them, but the Germans by then had moved them. And that's where the trail went cold. She also wrote to his groom, and his groom remembered that he was holding his horse, Colonel Brett's horse, obviously not really knowing what to do. The colonel had been killed, and so he was just standing at the side of the road. And at that point, Colonel Longley of the East Surreys turns up and says, "Who are you waiting for? Whose horse is that?" And he said, "Well, I'm Colonel Brett's groom, but sadly he's been killed." And so Longley says, "Well, I've lost my horse. I'm going to take this one." So Longley takes Brett's horse, mounts up, and heads off south towards the Marne and the retreat. So it was just a fascinating realisation, really, that before the war, these two fellas knew one another. And this was James Longley's Home Service helmet. And this was Charlie Brett's mess dress jacket. And just that random moment that the two of them there come together on the battlefield at Le Cateau after Brett's been killed. Longley leads a horse, and he takes Brett's horse. And I just thought it was just one of those coincidences that was worth telling. As I said, Charles Arthur Hugh Brett has no known grave, so nobody knows where he's buried. But he certainly isn't buried where the Frenchmen buried him immediately after the war. So the Germans will have buried him somewhere, and maybe he's now buried in a grave which simply says "Soldier of the Great War, known unto God." But sadly, Mrs. Brett never ever did manage to find out where he was. James Longley, on the other hand, had a very successful war. He was promoted pretty much all the way through. He was a very popular commanding officer. Everyone commented on his leadership and his bravery. He was mentioned in dispatches 10 times, served in Salonika as well as France and also Palestine. And in between the wars, he commands 44th Home Counties Brigade and I think Dover Garrison in the Second World War when he's called back out of retirement. And he ends his career knighted as Sir John Longley and as a Major General. So two soldiers who both start the Great War at the same rank, at the same level, and just shows how the fortunes of war can treat them so differently. One of whom is killed within a couple of weeks of the outbreak of war. The other goes on to have a very long and distinguished career.